John Whelan, yes sir. Yeah. Thanks for coming for the graveyard shift. The beer is coming in 10:20. We can get this over in 10 minutes.
At very short calls.
Yeah, the worst thing about panels is people talk too long about themselves. So my name is John Whelan, Trinity College, Dublin, Trinity Innovation and Enterprise. Set up the first open source program office in any European university is our claim to fame. Through help with Claire, who's, again, a big shout out to Claire for organising, being the key driver today. But one final point, just delighted to be part of a panel as a university innovation person, which is about SMEs. Rather than that we're not on the academic track. You know, the academic track is the boring academic track. This is about SMEs. I'm proud that a university is here on an SME track.
Next up.
Phil Weir from Flax and Teal, and I am working in a range of areas from scientific computing and simulation physics right through to cultural heritage, knowledge management. So we have a goal of increasing the use and awareness of open source, particularly in industries that aren't traditionally familiar with it, such as the IT industry. But we're also interested in trying to help creation of open source and encourage that as a pattern. We're based out of Belfast, but we work globally. And yeah, really interested to meet people here.
Oh, listen, you've heard enough from me today. But it is wearing my SME hat that I'm on this panel, and that is where I spend the bulk of my time with clients who are, I've done the whole corporate thing, and I get more crack out of working with SMEs because it's really valuable. But I also, like, the SME part of our society is frequently taken for granted, and increasingly now in this changing world need a leg up to kind of just platform for the next generation of what's coming. We've been hit with a lot of change in the last 2 decades particularly, so businesses of old have to look like new offers now, and that's where I spend most of my time. This has been a fascinating day, and I think bringing it down to reality and making it stick in real brass tacks in SME world is, I think, behoves all of us to have a big hard think about what we can do to make that happen.
I'll ask you then a question first, Kevin, because since you're an SME subject matter expert, pardon me, when I see SME competitiveness written down, it's usually on a white paper or a memo or the Irish Times, and I go, that's great, that's a good thing. But I don't know what it is. I mean, how many people are looking at the phrase SME competitiveness and taking different angles from it?
So I think this is part of our challenge, is the language that we use, right? So SME competitive, if you tell a fella with a widget factory in Longford that he's not competitive, he hasn't slept since 1982. Do you know what I mean? He is trying to make payroll on Friday. Or she is absolutely, if she gets one more phone call to say, oh, I can't come in, absolutely flat out, or they've just got a new customer, or a customer has not paid them, right? So if somebody tells them they're not competitive, like half the time they want to really now respond in an unparliamentary way, right? Because they have worked bloody hard. They've either grown a business or taken on a family business, and they're trying to keep it going. They're embedded in their communities. So sometimes the competitive piece can be almost construed as being lazy, or, there's a big conversation in Northern Ireland about productivity, right? But there's a challenge in that space because there's a lot of people who have taken themselves out of the workforce, right? But if you talk to an SME owner and they're working 80 hours a week, they're trying to keep people paid, mortgages paid, kids fed, we need to talk about things about enablers to minimise those problems, because the common denominator is they're time poor, they're resource poor, and it's hard to put your head up above the parapet and say, where do I go next? and to take that time to work in the business. So it's in that context that I want to participate in this conversation.
And so we're talking, I mean, so supports, enablers, that kind of thing.
That aren't patriarchal, that aren't sort of, competitiveness, need to work on your competitiveness. Like,
Yeah.
work with, not.
John, what sort of, do you hear the same phrase? Do you, when you're doing the tech transfers, and you hear it from inside the TCD halls? Do people talk about this? How do you relate to that?
Yeah, well, the first thing about, SMEs in Ireland, the S, it's with a capital S, Well, the M is like in Europe, it's the Mittelstand. In Germany, which is 500 people making, deep tech device widgets, but I think we're talking about open source really today and the advantage of open source for SMEs. And we concentrate on spinning out companies, which by definition are SMEs. And we have built them and supported them in open source business models for the last 15 years. And some of our most successful spin outs are based on open source core, all the various open source business models. So, that's a problem for the system to understand supports and competitiveness. How this, we all know here, we're kind of a biased audience. We're here, it's an open source conference. We all know about how open source works. But within the tech transfer university world, it was a bit of a battle to make that work, to get that understanding. And as you were speaking earlier, Catherine, about the education and the branding of open source, I said in this very room 10 years ago, this very feckin' room, excuse my French, feck is okay, isn't it?
It's after the
and one of the biggest law company in Ireland, and the top begins with a C, ends with an X, and rhymes with box.
We know what's going on.
But their top IP guy was here talking about licensing, and open source was dismissed as a joke. Like literally, I think you were there, Peter. Yeah. It was like, oh, this has never been enforced in law. They used the example, they took the Richard Stallman license, they went for the extreme about the beer license. That's the way open source works. You get a keg of, you get a 6-pack of beer. That's how they consider, but they've changed their tune now. Sorry, I kind of gone off point. So
Yeah,
bring me back to
no,
the question.
you've kind of, what I wanted to do is your background is quite different. I wanted to try and explore where your head was at in this particular thing, and I think you've kind of, you've said that, things were bad, things are now better, but we're still kind of going a little bit. So Phil, tell us about the business that you built and the open source angle on that and how that works out.
Well, I'll start by saying, just on competitiveness
Yeah.
point, what Catherine said. I had to stop myself standing on a chair there, because I don't think that'd be good for anyone.
It's not in the insurance.
No,
It's too tall, fall over.
I'm kind of curious now, you put sort of wonder. But yes, that would hurt our SME competitiveness if I fall off a chair at this event. Anyway, I'll try and answer that in the context of the original question as well. So, when I was working in Dundalk in a small engineering firm, one of the biggest challenges that we hit was that we were supplying people mostly in Central Europe and Western Europe, in aeronautics, biomedical, that sort of thing. And we would find that the software we were using and the suppliers that we were using would say things like, oh, you need to provide guarantees about how that works. We can't tell you how that works because that's our IP. And we were going, that's kind of difficult because we can fix this, but we don't get paid. And they were kind of going, gosh, if only you were a massive company and we cared.
Yeah.
And so, from my perspective, I said, well, talk about hurting competitivity. If you can't deliver a product, you're hurting competitivity, that word. So that's how upset I was about it. So I went out on my own and I said, look, I can see from my background experience how open source technologies are becoming best of breed in certain areas that they are not being used. And fundamentally, that is a commercial opportunity in a nutshell. So, how did that turn from me going off on one to sitting here today? Mostly because, as I think all of us can identify, once you meet Claire, you probably you do get to know these things, and you do discover these relationships, you do discover these networks, and that's really important. So I think that's one thing I will absolutely say, is it's those connections to people in this room, to people outside this room. The other thing is, how did that work from a business perspective? Well, actually, we went and we spoke to people who were on the kind of cusp. We tried to work out what is the offering that we are establishing. Well, in the public sector space, it's about trust. Transparency, trust, and also vendor lock-in. Now, how many times, I don't know how many people have worked or are in public sector, out of curiosity, have worked with public sector or in public sector?
Don't be shy.
Yes, it's okay, you're not about to get it. We'll be inclusive about this now. But one of the things that I think sometimes SMEs undervalue is how much pain there is in other sectors from dealing with SMEs. SMEs as suppliers can be a right pain in the whatever Joe was going to say. And I honestly think that for us was part of competitivity. How do we make sure that message gets across? And how do we make sure we follow through on that? So that's me. Then working with large enterprise, it's not necessarily that different, but certainly the maturing of the conversation around open source helps. So I was a bit wrong.
And I think, sorry, just in the old days, an example of how open source solved a sales competitiveness problem for small companies is the old days. Who remembers escrow, software and escrow? You know, yeah. And a lot of people don't, but that was the thing. I had my own software company for 10 years, and we had selling to telecoms, mobile network operators, and we had to put software for Vodafone Ireland in escrow. There was a company in Manchester that did it. So the software was in a vault, so that if we went bust, the younger people haven't come across this. This was a real thing. It was a service. Escrow is a service. And open source gets over that. And that's how so many of our companies have succeeded in selling into big clients, because they can, here's the code. You can.
I think from a small business perspective, on both being the vendor and the customer, I think there's a real opportunity, because as I said, and I think about a client I have at the minute who is a friend of mine. She rang me out of kind of desperation. I'm not sure if I'm going to get paid, but anyway, it was a different conversation. But she's the CEO of a services company, and she employs 400 people. Like, that's a lot of money. And she has private equity on board, and with a big scaling plan. She's a fabulous girl. She knows nothing about IT, right? And she rang me, she had this in the back of her head. She kind of thought, I'm going to do this thing, but I'm not sure I'm not sure all the dots join up. And I'm thinking about her today, because she has a whole series of, ancient tech and vendor lock-in, right? And she's going down a road with the next new vendor, right? And to get locked in again, right? And her business needs to be way more agile in what she's doing, because she's in the health sector, so she's got responsibilities, it's regulated, and all that sort of stuff. So she needs a plumber, effectively. She doesn't need a vendor, she needs a plumber to bring all of these pieces around. And I was here today thinking about this. So if there's her, there's 1,000,001 of her, right, who doesn't know where to go, doesn't know who to trust. She just happened to know me because she's a friend of mine. I still don't know what answers I'm going to give her, but all I know is that there's another solution to her challenge. She has a fella who does IT on a Friday kind of a thing, right? She has a managed service partner for literally just keeping the lights on. So there's a space where open source can de-risk decision making for businesses like that. They can almost crowdsource intelligence and resources that they don't have, because she's never going to stand up a technical IT team. She doesn't need one, right? But if she could follow the dots in an open source world that is robust, is trusted, and is meets regulation requirements and everything, she's got a solution for her business that's infinitely configurable for her business. Now, no vendor is out there selling the joining of the dots piece in a real way at a small business level. They're doing it, we'll land and expand in your enterprise and we'll join all those dots, and that's lovely. Now, if I'm an SME and I'm going, what am I paying for? Because if you're telling me this is off the shelf code, what am I paying for? So if you, to a CEO to my friend, you're selling the ability to join the dots, so she doesn't have to, in a way that keeps her business running and keeps her, compliant and all the things we were talking about earlier. Now, today has been a revelation for me because I'm not aware of people having those conversations. And I think that could be a game-changing opportunity in Ireland.
What I would say first, I just brought on a new client, and the agreement was that we will develop it under an open source sponsorship, right? And it was absolutely painful to deal with their legal team.
Yeah.
We'll put that aside, right? So far.
Big client, small client, tell me.
Big client.
Okay.
Yeah. But not corporate, but
Yeah.
large mid cap. And so far the experience has been we've had to educate them a lot. We're trying to help them.
Yeah.
And eventually the lawyer is politely pushed aside.
Lovely.
But when I hear what you're saying, I'm totally with you. I really sympathise with your friend, and I'm wondering, is she in a business where she's very unique in what she does, or is it almost like?
Not that unique.
Well, in that case, there might be two options. There's the open source, and you find a plumber. But that person will be very wary, as I am, of having to resource something where it's a fully productized business, but actually I'm getting paid like it's a custom software development contract.
Yeah.
Don't want to do that. The other option is you have a lot of customers like her, and you build an all-in-one vertical market software, which is also great. The problem is when you get stuck in between.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe just a follow-on on that, and I think this comes back to the competitiveness point in general, and I don't want to name any software, but if you can imagine, think, pluck from the air, software that you have a big commercial backer somewhere that's doing some licensing, probably at a national level. Then if you're sitting in an SME and you've got clear marketing material, you think you've got some vendor independence because lots of people can be implementers for this software. There is a lovely glossy page with all of the experiences that people in Manchester have had. And there is a challenge in either of those models in standing up against that and saying, well, actually, here are the thoughts, because ultimately, you're coming as an SME, there is a level of trust you have to build that someone else has got on their website. And there are some ways around that, I think. We work, that maybe mentioned earlier today, with a piece of software called Arches, and I really think it's a fascinating model. The Getty Institute in LA, who had a very difficult few weeks, as I'm sure you've seen.
On fire, didn't it?
Yeah. I think they managed to stave it off, but it was very touch and go. They did a project some years ago with the World Monuments Fund and established a piece of software. They paid for that to be built, it was commissioned, and they made a decision. We're not a software house, which, no offense to anyone who's worked in a large organisation that does a lot of building software when that fits the funding framework, but I think that was a really sensible decision. They said, what we want to do is build a community, not build software. And so they said, okay, well, how do we build a community? They went and they got people who had expertise in the open source space, and they said, come in. And we have all these questions. How do we get providers? How do we make sure it's not location-centric? How do we make sure we have buy-in, not just from California, but from the rest of the world? And how do we put our money where our mouth is? And that's, I happened to bump into somebody there years ago in Fosstown, and that's now one of the software we can use. But we very definitely leverage the fact that we can say, oh, have a look at this. Here's the website, here's the experiences. We are an implementer. It's not really that different a model. obviously we are then having to have that conversation, what are you delivering? Well, it's not a software license. But actually, that's fine. That's not that hard a conversation to have, because do you really want to go and deploy this software yourself? How much does it cost for you to have one engineer for a year? How much does it cost for a normal software license? Right, okay, well then just pay us. That's my sales pitch. I get my card, anyone wants to stop me afterwards, feel free.
Just on a logistics note, hands up. If anybody want to ask a question, the floor is open. Please just put your hand up and ask.
It'd be interesting just to hear use cases. If you have those cases, success cases for like SME companies, they are interesting.
I could talk about, thanks, some of our spin-outs. For example, one of our company's software radio systems, they built 10 years ago, you know, when GPUs came along, before they were, after being used in gaming, as we all know, they were used, it became possible to develop radio systems purely in software. All you needed was an antenna. And this was a classic research project in universities. And they wanted to spin out these researchers, and they wanted to open source. They knew it was driven by the researchers. They say, we're using our competitor. There was a GNU open radio, GPO or whatever it was. So I had to persuade people within the system, the funders, the agencies, to do that. But they now, you know, they are now a majorly, they employ 100 people. Actually, they moved to Barcelona because they were based in Cork and they couldn't hire people. That's another Irish political point to make, an Irish reality, that you cannot hire people even in Cork.
Even in Cork.
Even in Cork.
But, so as a use case, they employ so many people. That's open source. It's actually restrictive, and they're changing to permissive, which is an interesting dynamic. But that's another example is a company, Terminus DB, that do a non-relational database for banks, and they were working with Deutsche Bank, and they were able to say, you know, Deutsche Bank to buy this software, you know, from a small startup with 2 people, you know, SME with an S, 2 brilliant technical people, and they say, well, it's open source. Oh, okay. That gives us some comfort that you're going to be, if you collapse, we'll be able to, our engineers will be able to maintain it, which is kind of theoretical, but we talked about open washing earlier. There can be a little bit of open washing going on about how open is it really, but it's more open than having it sitting in a vault in a
I think there's a problem in also how we, and I referenced this earlier, we reward and support and applaud invention, and we give the appropriate tax treatment to invention. We pay less attention, well, kind of, if you're 55 accountants, if you are adapting or applying it in a different convention, you get nada, right? So we were just talking about it out there in the break, that's a conversation that needs to be had, right? But I think there's a bit of still with the marketing problem about what open source is and how you make that a play. The challenge being that, you know, you nearly need to create, you know, a digital playpen somewhere where somebody can sort of, you know, try it out and see what's happening in a way that's physically and financially supported, like to de-risk an engagement on something that is, you know, the vast majority of CEOs in a smaller organisation are probably not coming from a technical background. They may or may not have strong technical people in their business that have that evangelical approach to open source. So the safe thing could be, and I see you're coming to you in a minute, you know, the classic line is like, nobody ever get fired for hiring IBM. Like that was classic when I was coming up during big digital projects. Kind of the same thing could apply because it is a risk appetite, because it's something different.
I don't know, stitching a few ideas together here. Internally, we're always looking for, you know, who are our lighthouse customers for something. And that's how this other conversation started.
Yeah.
I mean, there's that fear of this will be a custom software development engagement, but not resourced properly on their side.
Yeah.
We're always looking for, can we have more than one person tell us this is really a pain point for them, and maybe have a bunch of them together as lighthouse customers,
Yeah.
so that together they amortize that cost, they get the results, but for each of them it's closer to a trivial bet with an asymmetric upside for them.
Yeah.
But there's enough of them that we would feel confident that there's validation if we were to go beyond that. I think there's something there where, could be on the order of, say, up to a dozen, no more than that, because otherwise it's hard to aggregate them and coordinate them and herd the cats. But if Enterprise Ireland, maybe, if they don't want to pony up some money, that's where I think these feasibility grants should be. So
Yeah.
And this basically goes to exactly the point that you made earlier on in terms of the absorption capacity of SMEs to take on this innovation.
Yeah.
Pooling the innovation in 10 or 12 or whatever else would be a way to facilitate that. Be also a way for facilitating us, the universities, I work in universities as well, to actually engage with SMEs in a more meaningful way and not have those bad experiences you talked about. Because we all know them, John and I, we know those engagements where we've screwed up somehow or whatever else. But it's because we're dealing with that one SME who cannot take it on. They come with, say, an innovation voucher or whatever else. They come with a question, but it's not the question they need answered. It's the one they think they need answered, but they haven't gone through, business model innovation, service innovation first to know what the right question is before they start the conversation about open source or whatever else.
I have a follow-up thought on that, unless you wanted to respond first.
No, but just one thing is that AI have just rejigged themselves sectorally.
Yes.
Maybe
That
there's
hasn't
enough.
played out yet.
No, but but this is, I love getting in at the beginning, right? Because you get to have a conversation
Yes.
before the cement has set.
Yeah. And it's still static, yes. It's still warm.
Hatching a plan.
So one thing I noticed just in terms of the discussion about success stories, and this will segue, but I think that is a really good question. I also think there's a risk, especially in an open source event, that we're thinking about success stories of open source suppliers, whereas actually for SME competitiveness, it's adopters. And I think in that sense, there's the trivially obvious things of, how many companies have managed to get up and running with their WordPress sites where otherwise they would have been, and that can go right from there through to, for example, some of the technologies that we're working with in the finite element engineering space that are robust, transparent, well-packed, and allowing access to software that would cost £20,000 a year for no license. So I think I'll give, however, an example of where open source within the business can provide a benefit. I'm not going to do the obvious thing of being like, look at us, because I don't think that's A, helpful, and B, as Catherine was describing, it never really feels like your success. I think that's part of the SME experience. But I'll say Buddybase. Has anyone come across Buddybase? They're an interesting company that they did a no-code framework. Their no-code framework got picked up by governments in different places and companies because it was open source. And so they started to get phone calls from places around the world being like, we're using this, and we got a bit stuck, can you give us a hand? Now that wasn't, to the best of my knowledge of talking to them, that wasn't their primary goal of doing so. It was just seemed like a sensible way to work. But that actually brought unintended benefits. So I suppose if you want to think of a success story in that sense, that's the point of doing it. Martin, who's back there, hey Martin, and I do a lot of work together. Martin and I started working together because we said, well, how can we collaborate as companies? Martin's company and my company, both based in Belfast. Open source facilitated that. It made easier ways to do collaboration, to get off the ground. There's another success story, how open source can facilitate collaboration. But I think to come back to your point, I think you're absolutely right. It's not just about collaboration, it's also about coordination. And sometimes I think that can be a bit of a dirty word in open source, because people want the independence of open source, but actually being able to provide okay, let's have a couple of providers come together, even potentially, maybe competitors. I was over in London last week with one of our direct competitors, and we sat down and tried to make a document together, pooling our understanding, because ultimately we're competitors in a specific space, but we're both much more benefited by growing the market.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right, and I think that I think SMEs also have a responsibility to recognise the challenges of, like I say, of dealing with SMEs. How do you give a fund to one small company to implement something by another small company and make that look like it's got a return on investment? I think that's an absolutely fair question, and I really like your suggestion of trying to collar some people today.
I think we have to build incentives.
I think you've made a very good point, Phil, that I didn't answer your question properly because, yeah, the use cases.
Sorry, Tom, that wasn't an attack.
No, that's right. And I think every startup now is an example of an adopter of open source. If they get somebody to build a website, on some proprietary platform, but it goes much deeper than that. It's all tools. We all know it's assembly. It's the glue of putting them together to allow you to focus on your core innovation, then your core, unique service, unique product that your core skills. But there's a huge compatibility problem there. Then you get into the real technical side about what stuff will work together, and that's where we're seeing companies raise money now in the kind of Gen AI boom. You saw, Sean Blanchfield raising 4 million last month in Ireland for building the glue, or back to middleware.
Yeah.
Pardon?
God forbid.
Yeah. It's back to the picks and shovels for the gold rush, whatever. That's where SMEs can. Sorry, I'm conscious of time.
And I think that's kind of what we potentially want to avoid in this particular situation, isn't it? I mean, not the platformy stuff, but more the kind of, here's a bunch of people that are leaning against each other to stay in business, and they all have a similar problem. Can they come on group and get, find out what they need and be, be allowed to adopt what they need and get approved in a way that is collaborative, which will build the trust, but is also incentivized in the right way so that people actually
It's
provide it.
difficult to.
And it's not trivial.
I mean, I can tell you a story. I had my own software company for 10 years, and we used to get on a plane to London to when Hutchison Whampoa got their 3G license. We were working with them, and you get off the plane, and there'd be a guy there waiting with Hutchison Whampoa with the card for me and my colleagues. And there was another Irish company there that I know very well, and he would follow me to see who was I meeting, because we were competing. It is tough. Maybe it's a younger generation thing, but when you're in your own business, to work with a competitor it's not easy.
But if you're in a pool, to your point, with and you're almost pre-qualified, so it's not a big stretch for me to make a call on somebody who's already in the pool, right? The relationship will still be, the relationship, but it's that social confirmation that, okay, yeah, well, he's not an axe murderer, or they're good, or, well, they helped them, and yeah, okay, they're in hospitality, but I'm over here. It's that social pre-qualification that helps us make more informed decisions. And there was a gentleman I spoke to earlier, about back to mine, I was talking about contracts this morning. But the length, so the challenge we have now, I've talked about resource poor and time poor, but the time to market for end-to-end, starting from scratch, building it out, right? No, Moore's Law has lapped us, right? All our heads are spinning even in what happened in kind of the cut through in the big AI world in the last 2 weeks, right? That's overwhelm to a busy person who has 40 million decisions to make before breakfast, right? I just want to make fewer decisions. Just make it easy. And if we start making it complicated and it's all very niche and it's all very special and aren't we special, good luck. Not going to happen. We need to make it accessible. We need to make it trustworthy. We need to make it relevant and relatable to all of our businesses.
One here.
Well, yeah, just a question about making it relatable. I'm trying to think about what are the overheads to a small business, to a small and medium business that you can largely remove by having a, open source or like standardized system of doing it. So, right, if I want to set up a small business, I have to take care of taxes. I have to take care of legal side. I have to take care of, payroll. Like there are a bunch of just basic daily overhead logistical things, which are the nightmares for the person who's growing the business. And it's exactly, I forget which presentation this was in, the two circles, right? That you've got the circle of the open source, and then you've got your delta on that. And as a small business, more than a bigger business, you need to optimize your time and spend your time on the delta rather than the things that's common across all the small businesses. So I guess in your eyes, what are the expenses, the overheads for small businesses that's kind of common across small businesses, and how can those be, those costs be reduced by standardization and open source?
People?
Yeah.
Sorry, this is like, that's the biggest problem, biggest cost base, but also biggest head wreck from a CEO's perspective. If I was working and I was making the choice to go open source, I'd actually be making a choice to have a digital concierge. That's what I'd want. Just tell me.
So I just wanted to give, I looked at Buddy Base, looked really interesting, and they seem like Odoo to me, a similar, probably better.
Different space, but yeah.
But that's what came to my mind. So what's interesting, I mean, there's the story of this Irish company, Greg, who wants to support a local business. They're open source, so you're not locked in. What's missing is the plumber there. And it sounds like it could possibly be something that's relatively flexible and generic enough that could work for a lot of, let's say broadly, the purpose of digitizing workflows in a, let's call it a traditional SME, like a widget factory in vitro. Before they could possibly think about getting most of the labor productivity we all foresee with AI, they need to possibly look at digitizing this first and get more leverage out of the AI systems down the road. Again, I don't necessarily, maybe they can fund it themselves, perhaps, it'd be nice if they did, but funding that plumber to come in and digitize your business for you with internal tools on an open source system that you're not locked into, where there are other plumbers who could take that person's space if they don't meet spec. That seems like just generally, that's an interesting thematic area for all traditional SMEs.
I'd agree. I think maybe a challenge there. Sorry to jump in.
No.
I think there's maybe a challenge there again of positioning and getting that message across, because naturally, I loved your farmer example earlier. How do you establish that trust in the first place? Because you're coming along saying, I've got this great system, me and my mates, right? And there is a level of trust you have to build that ultimately, if you come along with big pockets of fancy suit, that's actually not the highest bar that you're going to have to jump. And I think, to reiterate that point about people, what's the thing that can be removed? For me, as not thinking as a service provider or somebody that implements or a computational scientist, whatever I am, I'm not sure anymore. Thinking as a CEO, what's the thing that I look and think, oh my goodness, about money? It is people, and especially if you're a service company, people's time is very literally money. And we do an away week once or twice a year, because we are an international team. We bring people together, and by far the biggest cost of that is the lost money, by an order of magnitude. Yeah. And people are, and I know Pernay has had to sit in there, has had to try and make sure our costs are reasonable and everything. But the reality is, our flights can be whatever they are. It's not going to compare against the person cost. And I think that's whatever the solution is. I think that's the point that has to be made. That, okay, you can work with this off-the-shelf tools. Is that going to take, it's open source or it's closed source? Don't care. Is it going to mean that my people are spending more time fiddling with things and trying to solve them? And that's where I think sometimes open source companies, sitting on his chair at the front, but sometimes I think open source companies forget that it's actually, we're giving you this modifiable stuff. Oh, who's going to modify it? Who's going to take their time? Who's going to spend time modifying it for me? And I think that comes back to your point. That's not adding value, that's taking value. And I think if you are able to say, well, actually, as when I was in the engineering company back at the dock, our problem was we could not deliver, because we had people with skills, but we could not deliver a product, a final outcome, a report, because there was a bug in a proprietary piece of code. And they told us, oh, we'll get back to that at some point next year.
It's not on our roadmap.
Yeah, not on our roadmap. Formula One didn't want it. So I think that, to me, if someone came to me then and said, and that, talk about a sales pitch, I went out and started a company, I was so annoyed about it. And I think that's got to be part of that discussion. It is about the vendor lock-in, it is about the competitors, it is about the alternatives, and ultimately, it's about making lives easier for the people in the companies.
Yeah.
That is where the commercial, for me as an SME owner anyway, and certainly in the services industry, that's where the money is.
100%. Can't emphasize that enough. Make it easy, do the thinking for me, make it go away.
Sales 101.
Yeah, that's
It's all about productivity. Like how can you unlock latent productivity in business, especially smaller businesses who could possibly grow in terms of percentage growth rates a lot faster. This really hit home to me just the other day when I was listening to an entrepreneur. She was talking about her construction software business. And she focuses on specialty contractors who go to a job site and the fellow running the company will have, say, just plumbing, 3 plumbers on different each on different job sites all over a city. It's chaos, it's hectic. And a lot of these companies tend to be under 30 people, but it's only really the way the economics work for them. It only makes sense for them to have a back office person and about 50 people.
Yeah.
And she's telling this story of a client, they onboarded the client, only had 15, the guys running around doing 100 hours a week, couldn't hire a back office person. She said, look, I'll go in, I'll install it. If you're not happy, I'll sort you out. He was able to grow his contracting business within 45 days to 45 people. Because there were so many contracts he just couldn't take.
Yeah.
And it's those kinds of things you want to figure out. What's the equivalent for the widget factory person?
And the case studies. We want people to be able to see that.
Yeah.
Folks, we're at time. Thank you very, very much indeed, both my esteemed panelists and my esteemed audience, and the team, the audio-vis team as well, and everybody else that helped out. I've heard there's booze outside, so I'll keep this quick. We've got a couple of good reports here that come from the Open Ireland Network. Please, I'm sorry, Johnny, I hit you with them. Please, you'll find QR codes around the place, which will allow you to sign up and join the crew. So please do that and check out the reports while you're there. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the rest of your evening.